The night glimmered with elegance and quiet power. The White House stood under a veil of silver moonlight, its white pillars gleaming like marble guardians of history. Inside, the grand ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers that sparkled with thousands of tiny reflections, fragments of light that danced across the polished floor and the golden frames of portraits lining the walls. It was not just another political dinner. It was a gathering of influence, reputation, and quiet calculation. Donald Trump, dressed in a crisp black suit, stood at the head of the room, his familiar confidence radiating as he greeted each guest with a firm handshake and practiced smile. Laughter and soft jazz music mingled with the gentle clinking of glasses. The air smelled of expensive wine, polished wood, and anticipation. Among the dignitaries and celebrities stood Keanu Reeves, a figure of serenity amid the noise. Dressed simply in a black tuxedo with a dark tie, he carried himself with that calm, almost spiritual grace the world had come to know him for. He wasn't there as an actor tonight. He had been invited as a voice of reason, a global symbol of humility and peace in a world too often driven by ego. He stood near the balcony doors, half shadowed by the soft golden light, holding a glass of red wine that shimmered like liquid fire. Outside, the Washington night was quiet, the stars faint beyond the city glow. Keanu's eyes were fixed on the horizon, distant yet aware. A journalist nearby had asked him earlier about his philosophy on success, and his reply still lingered in the air. Peace is the only power that doesn't corrupt. You can't own it. You can only live it. Those who overheard had fallen silent for a moment, not because of fame, but because of truth. As the evening went on, conversations floated across the hall. Politics, economy, fame. But beneath the elegance, there was tension, like a faint current beneath calm water. The Secret Service agents positioned discreetly around the room seemed unusually alert. Their eyes darted more than usual, their earpieces crackling softly. Trump, ever the showman, raised a toast, his voice booming through the hall. To peace through strength, and to our guests who remind us what America stands for. The crowd clapped, glasses chimed. Keanu smiled faintly, polite but thoughtful. Then, for just a second, he felt something. A shift. A subtle change in the air. Beyond the tall balcony doors, faint blue and red flashes pulsed in the distance, almost too distant to notice unless you were looking for them. He turned his head slightly, eyes narrowing. The sound of tires screeching far down Pennsylvania Avenue whispered through the night. The laughter in the ballroom continued. The music played on, but Keanu's intuition stirred. Something big was coming, something that didn't belong in a place of chandeliers and speeches. The laughter and conversation inside the White House carried on, but outside, the night had changed its rhythm. The moonlight that once rested gently on the White House lawn was now fractured by flashing streaks of red and blue. The distant hum of engines grew louder, a mechanical growl that didn't belong to a quiet diplomatic evening. At the North Gate, a convoy of black SUVs came to a sudden halt, their doors slamming open in unison. From the first vehicle stepped a woman whose presence seemed to silence the air itself. She was tall, striking, and disciplined, her dark uniform perfectly pressed, her cap tilted at a precise angle. Captain Thandeka Mbeki, a South African police officer known across borders for her precision and fearlessness, had arrived on U.S. soil under direct international authority. The White House guards, startled, immediately moved to intercept, but she flashed a metallic badge stamped with the crest of Interpol and the South African Police Service. "By international directive," she announced, her voice sharp but calm, "we are here for Keanu Reeves." The Secret Service agents hesitated. The name alone created a ripple of confusion. "Ma'am," one agent began, "you can't—" But before he could finish, Thandeka lifted a document folder, an arrest warrant, stamped, sealed, and co-signed by multiple agencies. Her confidence was unshakable. Behind her, a full tactical squad emerged, their boots striking the pavement in unison, forming a dark line against the glowing facade of the White House. Cameras from waiting journalists began to flash. The news vans that had been covering the dinner's arrivals turned their lenses toward the commotion. Reporters began whispering into microphones, voices trembling with curiosity and excitement. Breaking news from the White House: law enforcement units have arrived unexpectedly. Inside, the Secret Service radioed the alert. The ballroom doors closed swiftly and the music halted. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. President Trump turned toward his detail chief with visible irritation. "What's going on out there?" he demanded. Moments later, an agent whispered into his ear. Trump's expression shifted from annoyance to surprise, and then disbelief. "Keanu Reeves?" he repeated under his breath. "For what?" At that moment, the grand doors opened. Captain Thandeka stepped in, her boots echoing against the marble. The bright chandelier light glinted off the silver insignia on her shoulder. Her eyes scanned the room until they met Keanu's calm, steady gaze from across the hall. For a brief second, the world seemed to pause, the contrast between them striking. Keanu's quiet serenity against Thandeka's rigid authority. The silence was electric. "I'm Captain Thandeka Mbeki of the South African Police," she said firmly. "Keanu Reeves, you are under international investigation. You are requested to come with us immediately." The grandeur of the White House ballroom had turned into a stage of disbelief. The chandeliers still shimmered, but their golden glow now seemed cold, too bright for what was unfolding beneath them. The sound of cameras outside echoed faintly through the marble corridors. Inside, no one moved. The air itself felt heavy. Donald Trump stood near the head of the long dining table, his expression a blend of confusion and irritation. His staff whispered frantically behind him, flipping through their phones, trying to make sense of the sudden intrusion. "This wasn't cleared," one of the Secret Service officers muttered. "There's no international warrant on record." Across the room, Captain Thandeka Mbeki stood firm, a pillar of composure amid the rising tension. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, were locked on Keanu Reeves. Around her, the tactical squad fanned out, boots echoing against the marble floor as they secured the exits. The hum of radios and the faint static from their earpieces filled the silence like a pulse. Keanu remained calm. He didn't retreat, didn't protest. He simply observed. There was no anger in his eyes, only curiosity, as though he were trying to understand the energy that had suddenly taken hold of the room. "I'm not sure what this is about," he said quietly, his voice steady but soft. "But if you believe it's necessary, I'll cooperate." Thandeka stepped forward, her tone clipped and professional. "You're being detained for questioning under international coordination. A financial operation you've been linked to crosses South African jurisdiction. You'll be escorted to D.C. headquarters immediately." The guests began to murmur. The tension was tangible, billionaires, diplomats, and celebrities exchanging nervous glances. Some raised their phones to record, only to be silenced by Secret Service agents. The contrast between Keanu's stillness and everyone else's panic made him seem almost untouchable, as if he stood in a different dimension from the chaos. Trump finally broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising. "He's one of the most respected people in the world. You think Keanu Reeves is some kind of criminal?" His tone wavered between defense and disbelief. But Thandeka didn't flinch. "With all due respect, Mr. President," she replied firmly, "the law doesn't discriminate by fame. My orders come from higher than politics." The words carried through the hall like a sharp wind. Even the agents seemed taken aback by her confidence. Keanu smiled faintly, not mockingly, but with a quiet sadness. "It's all right," he said, turning to Trump. "Sometimes life gives us moments that test who we really are." He looked back at Thandeka. "Let's go." The officer hesitated for a brief second. Something in his voice, something in his composure, made her falter. She nodded once, signaling her team. The ballroom doors opened again, letting in the flashing blue light from the outside. The crowd parted still. The White House doors burst open to a flood of flashing lights and chaotic motion. The peaceful elegance of moments ago was gone, replaced by the roar of engines, the hiss of radios, and the rhythmic stomp of boots on concrete. Reporters had gathered like vultures in the night, their camera flashes turning the front steps into a storm of light. Keanu Reeves stepped outside, flanked by the South African officer Captain Thandeka Mbeki and two members of her squad. His tuxedo, once pristine, now looked out of place under the harsh red and blue glare of police lights. His expression, however, was unchanged, calm, focused, almost serene. Trump's voice echoed from behind the security line, shouting for an explanation, but his words were swallowed by the chaos. Secret Service agents stood uncertain, caught between diplomatic protocol and the unexpected authority of an international police operation. The night wind brushed against Keanu's hair as he descended the steps. He could hear the buzz of journalists, the click of camera shutters, the low murmur of disbelief from the gathered crowd. For a brief moment, he looked upward at the glowing White House behind him, a symbol of power now shrouded in confusion. Thandeka's tone was clipped, professional. "Mr. Reeves, for the record, you are under temporary arrest pending investigation. Any resistance will be documented." Keanu turned to her and spoke softly. "I understand. But remember, Captain, how we act in anger defines us more than any law." Her eyes flickered with something, irritation or perhaps a moment of doubt, but she quickly masked it. She nodded to her officers. "Proceed." Two policemen stepped forward, moving to secure his hands. But one of them, perhaps out of tension, reached too roughly, jerking Keanu's arm. The crowd gasped as Keanu instinctively shifted his stance, not aggressively, but fluidly, almost like a dancer avoiding a stumble. The officer lost his balance slightly, his own force betraying him. Cameras caught the moment, a dozen flashes immortalizing Keanu's effortless calm amid the chaos. Reporters shouted, "He resisted! Did you see that?" While others murmured, "No, he didn't fight back. He moved with grace." Thandeka raised her hand, commanding silence among her team. "Enough!" she barked. "No one touches him unless I say so." For a heartbeat, even the sirens seemed to pause. The air hung thick with tension. The iconic actor standing still, surrounded by a fortress of authority and flashing lights, yet appearing as if he were in control of the entire scene. Keanu slowly extended his wrists, offering them voluntarily. "You don't need to use force," he said, his voice steady, almost compassionate. "Peace doesn't surrender to violence. It transcends it." That line, captured by a nearby journalist's microphone, would replay across global news within the hour. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the crowd fell silent. The metal glinted under the convoy sliced through the night like a dark blade. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, echoing through the silent streets of Washington, D.C. As the black SUVs approached the downtown precinct, the tension inside grew heavier with every passing second. Keanu sat quietly in the back seat, hands cuffed, eyes gazing out the window at the blur of city lights. He didn't look frightened, only thoughtful, like a man searching for meaning in the chaos that had suddenly swallowed his life. Captain Thandeka Mbeki sat opposite him, her expression rigid. She avoided his eyes, though every now and then she glanced up as if expecting him to protest, to fight back, to act like the powerful man the world knew him to be. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "You seem troubled, Captain. You're doing your job, but not your heart." Her jaw tightened. "Save your philosophy for court, Mr. Reeves," she replied coldly. But something in her voice wavered, a sliver of discomfort that she couldn't quite suppress. When the SUVs finally came to a stop outside the police headquarters, a wave of noise hit them. Reporters, flashbulbs, and shouting voices. The news had spread like wildfire. Cameras surrounded the entrance. Journalists pressed against barricades, microphones raised high. Why was Keanu Reeves arrested? What's the charge? Is he resisting? The scene was chaos. As the car doors opened, blinding light poured in. Officers formed a protective line, but the shouting only grew louder. "Look here! Keanu, say something!" The flashes painted his face in white and red bursts. Still cuffed, he stepped out slowly, his calm composure cutting through the storm like a blade of light. Thandeka followed behind, her steps hard, deliberate. But beneath the firm posture, frustration was building, not toward him, but toward the absurdity of the moment. Yet pride demanded she remain in control. "Bring him forward," she ordered. Keanu was led toward the precinct steps, where cameras zoomed in relentlessly. One officer reached for his sunglasses, still resting on his collar, and handed them to Thandeka. Without warning, she yanked them off and threw them onto the ground. The gesture was sharp, almost symbolic, a stripping away of dignity. The crowd gasped. "Do you think this is a movie?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the noise. "This is real life, Mr. Reeves. You're under arrest, not under the spotlight." Keanu stood silently for a long moment. The flashes kept coming, the world watching his every breath. Then he spoke, quietly, but with such gravity that the chaos seemed to fade. "Respect doesn't come from uniforms or titles, Captain. It comes from how we treat one another, even when we don't have to." The crowd hushed. Even some officers froze, caught off guard by the quiet dignity in his tone. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The powerful woman in command and the man in chains, facing each other like reflections of pride and peace. The heavy metal door closed behind them with a final clang, muffling the chaos of the media storm outside. Inside, the Washington, D.C. police headquarters was dimly lit, all gray concrete and fluorescent hum. The air smelled faintly of coffee, ink, and tension. Keanu Reeves was led through a long corridor lined with glass offices. Officers and detectives paused as he passed, whispering in disbelief. It wasn't every day that one of the world's most beloved figures was escorted in cuffs. Some faces showed curiosity, others, quiet sympathy. But Keanu walked with silent dignity, his footsteps measured, his head unbowed. Captain Thandeka Mbeki walked behind him, her pace brisk, her thoughts tangled. She had executed dozens of arrests in her career, politicians, traffickers, even corrupt officers. But this one felt different. Something about his calm unsettled her, made her question the papers she'd signed, the orders she'd obeyed. They entered a small interrogation room, bare walls, one metal table, 2 chairs, a single overhead light casting sharp shadows. A recording camera blinked red in the corner. Keanu was seated, the cuffs removed at her order. His wrists bore faint red marks, but he didn't rub them. Instead, he folded his hands and looked up at her with quiet curiosity. Thandeka placed a thick file on the table and opened it with a sharp flick. "You're being questioned regarding offshore accounts tied to a South African charity that received unauthorized transfers linked to criminal activity. Your name appears in those financial records." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "A charity?" he repeated. "I've supported hundreds. If there's a mistake, I'll help you fix it." Her tone hardened. "We'll see if it's a mistake. For now, you're here under suspicion." The light buzzed faintly. A long silence stretched between them. Then Keanu leaned forward just a little. "Do you believe I'm guilty, Captain?" The question caught her off guard. "Belief isn't my job," she said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. Keanu smiled faintly, not arrogantly, but with a kind of sad gentleness. "Maybe not. But justice isn't just about rules. It's about heart. If you chase truth without compassion, you end up catching nothing." She exhaled, trying to maintain her composure. "You talk like a philosopher for a man in custody." "I talk like a man who's been misunderstood before," he replied softly. Something in that answer struck her. a flicker of empathy breaking through the wall of duty. She looked down at the file, flipping through the documents, suddenly unsure. The more she read, the less it made sense. Transactions from countries he'd never visited, signatures that didn't match, details began to crumble under scrutiny. Finally, she closed the file. "If what you're saying is true," she said quietly, "someone's gone to great lengths to set you up." Keanu leaned back, calm as ever. "Truth doesn't need to shout, Captain. It just waits to be seen." Morning broke softly over Washington, D.C., painting the skyline in pale gold and silver. The chaos of the night before had faded into whispers across news channels and flashing headlines. Keanu Reeves arrested at the White House. But why? Outside the police headquarters, reporters still camped out, their breath fogging in the early chill, waiting for any word from inside. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly. The once bustling corridors had slowed to an uneasy calm. Captain Thandeka Mbeki sat alone in her office, eyes heavy from a sleepless night. A dozen files lay scattered across her desk, printouts, emails, bank statements, official orders. The evidence that once seemed so clear now looked like a web of lies. Her hands trembled slightly as she held up the report from Interpol. A new update marked urgent. It confirmed what her gut had been whispering since the interrogation. The financial data had been falsified. The real culprits were using Keanu's charitable foundation as a shell to launder money. He was not the mastermind, he was the victim. Thandeka's heart sank. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly, the weight of guilt pressing against her chest. For the first time in years, she questioned not the law, but herself. Across the hall, in the holding area, Keanu Reeves sat quietly on a metal bench. His hands rested loosely in his lap. Despite the long night and harsh lights, he seemed untouched by bitterness. A young officer brought him coffee, hesitant, almost reverent, and Keanu thanked him with a small smile that somehow made the sterile room feel warmer. Moments later, the door opened. Thandeka stood there, not as the stern officer of the night before, but as a woman carrying remorse in her eyes. She held no file, no badge in her hand, only truth. "Mr. Reeves," she said softly, "you're free to go." Keanu looked at her, calm as ever. "So it was a mistake?" She nodded slowly. "A mistake that shouldn't have happened. The investigation proved you had no involvement. Someone used your name. I'm sorry." There was silence, the kind of silence that says more than words. Then Keanu stood, extending his hand. She hesitated before taking it. His grip was firm, but gentle. Forgiveness without conditions. "I don't hold grudges," he said quietly. "I hold lessons." Thandeka's eyes glistened. "I misjudged you," she admitted. He gave a faint smile. "We all do sometimes. What matters is what we do next." As they stepped outside, the morning sun bathed them both in golden light. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, shouting questions. But Keanu didn't speak. He simply raised a hand, not to silence them, but to offer peace. A black car waited at the curb, sent by the White House. From inside, Donald Trump himself watched, his face unreadable. When Keanu approached, Trump stepped out, extended his hand, and said quietly, "You handled that better than most men would have.